Release the Kraken!
Hello Internet, my name is Damian Michaels, but you can call me Blue, and welcome back to another episode of Blues Brews. This week, we're moving along with playing each legal companion in Historic Brawl. So far, we've played Umori, Zerda, Obosh, and Gigantha. We've got 4 more to go, and we're moving on to Garuda, Doom of Depths. So this was actually the very last companion deck I built. I talked the last couple of weeks about how I didn't know how to tackle Gigantha or Obosh, but Garuda was a bit easier than that. Part of why I put off building this one for so long is because I wasn't sure who to make the commander. The idea of Garuda is simple. The Kraken enters, and both players mill 4 cards, and you get to put something with even mana value from among them into play. The issue is, this only happens once. Unlike other companions that have a static ability that generates value or end the game, like Lurrus or Obosh, Garuda is just an ETB trigger, and it doesn't lend itself to abuse the ability. At least Yorion is designed to blink things, so the deck will just naturally have ways to abuse the Sky Noodle. I did a lot of digging to find something I felt would be powerful enough to stand on its own if Garuda ever gets shut down or otherwise indisposed. I tried some generically good commanders at first, like Atraxa, Praetor's Voice, Obika, Splitter of Seconds, but both were missing some key pieces from the restriction, and I felt it wasn't taking full advantage of Garuda with these decks. I scrapped both of those and started looking at just blue and black commanders. What do we have that works with Garuda, reanimating, and milling, but is also good on its own? Lazav the Multifarious can become copies of things that get milled, so that's a cool way to reuse things, but we lose the ETB triggers from them, so that ended up being a dud. Talion the Kindly Lord had my interest at one point, but it fell flat too. Talon eventually earned a spot in the 99, but I scrapped it as the commander. I tried Rona, Herald of Invasion, Krydel of Baldur's Gate, and Kel's Fight Fixer, but again, they all felt like they weren't good enough on their own with the Garuda restriction. I needed something that fell in line with the reanimation plan, but also worked with blinking Garuda to get multiple uses out of it. And that's when I noticed Satoru the Infiltrator. The way she's worded, she's designed to work with ninjutsu and plot, so I initially overlooked her. But she also draws cards when you blink something or reanimate something from the graveyard, since both of those actions allow a creature to enter without it being cast. It was in that moment that I realized I had the perfect commander. So the deck as a whole is simple. We play Garuda, mill some cards, and get some value. If we hit a clone effect like Clever Impersonator, we get to make another Garuda to do it again. The dream is to hit a clone that makes a non-legendary copy like Spark Double, so all of our subsequent copies can copy that one so they actually get to stick around. Even if we do just keep hitting clones that enter and die immediately, we're still drawing cards with Satoru and digging for something that can end the game. We have a ton of removal stapled onto bodies with things like Ravenous Chupacabra, Hostage Taker, and Noxious Gearhulk, as well as a handful of counters for protection like Pact of Negation, Mana Drain, and Tail's End. Honorable mention to Urtai's Resurrected and Drown in the Lock, which can do both. Lastly, there's a decent chunk of cards that let us blink a creature or make a copy of a creature, so cards like Thassa Deep Dwelling, Helm of the Host, and Lithoform Engine let us get repeated uses out of Garuda or any of our other creatures that trigger when they enter the battlefield. Well, that covers basically everything important, so we're just going to jump into the games from here and see this Demon Kraken in action. Game 1. We're on the play against the Scarab God, and we keep at 7. We start off with a tapped Inundated Archive and pass the turn. Opponent starts things off with a tapped Seagate and passes it back. We untap and play and crack a Misty Rainforest. We go grab an untapped Watery Grave and play Satoru before passing. Opponent plays a Swamp and cast a Metallic Mimic naming Zombie before passing it back. We untap and immediately move to combat. We attack for 2, and they can't block because of Menace. Second main, we play Drowned Catacombs and put Garuda in hand before passing the turn. Opponent untaps and plays a Drowned Catacombs themselves, followed by a Fleshbag Marauder. This makes both players sack a creature, so they sack the Fleshbag, and we sack our Satoru. Opponent attacks for 2 and passes the turn. We untap and play and crack a Scalding Tarn. This lets us grab an island, so we can play Talon the Kindly Lord. We choose 3 and pass the turn. Opponent untaps and plays an island. They finally decide to play Swift End, targeting our Talon. Would you look at that? 3 was the safe bet. Opponent attacks for 2 and passes. We untap and immediately drop Panharmonicon. Surprisingly, it resolves, and we play a Restless Reef before passing it back. Opponent untaps and plays a Phyrexian Tower, followed by the Scarab God. They move to combat and attack for 2 before passing it back to us. We untap and play a Pathway on black and cast Garuda. Garuda resolves, and Panharmonicon makes it trigger twice, so Garuda's text box was replaced with "You win the game," it would seem. Game 2. We're on the draw, and we keep at 7. Opponent starts with a tapped land and passes the turn. We start things by playing a Port of Karfell tapped and passing. Opponent untaps and plays a Jetmir's Garden before passing themselves. We untap and play a Swamp, followed by Mox Amber we drew for turn. We follow this up with Saturu and pass it back. Opponent untaps and plays a red land and follows this up with a Crowd Shredder Sliver. They attack for 1 and pass the turn. We untap and play a Swamp before going to combat. We attack for 2 and hit. After combat, we cast Thassa Deep Dwelling and move to end step. Thassa blinks Saturu, effectively untapping it, but Saturu's ability will also draw us a card before we pass the turn. Opponent untaps and plays another land and plays a Rally the Ranks. This is followed closely by a Sentinel Sliver to give everything vigilance. They move to combat and attack for 5, dropping us to 19 before they pass the turn. We untap and play Marsh Flats, leaving it uncracked. This turn, we're just going to put Garuda in hand and hold up Counterspell. No point in attacking, so we move to end step. Thassa blinks Saturu and draws us a card before moving to cleanup. We discard Mirror Hall Mimic and pass the turn. Opponent untaps and plays a Shattered Sanctum, followed by a Leeching Sliver. Oh boy, this is bad. I don't know why I didn't counterspell this, but I didn't, so I guess we're going to 9. Opponent passes, so we crack our fetch to grab a Surveil land. We need something good here. Oh, that works, sort of. We untap and play and crack a Polluted Delta. We go to grab an island and cast River's Rebuke, targeting our opponent. They pick everything up and we move to combat. We attack for 2 because Thassa is going to blink it at the end step to untap it, so there's no reason not to attack. We draw a card and pass the turn. We're still in trouble though, because the opponent has a Haste Sliver. They of course cast it with a Bloodline Pretender. They attack for 3 and pass the turn. We untap and we need to start turning things around. We cast Noxious Gearhulk, a card we've seen a lot in this series, to blow up the Bloodline Pretender. We move to combat and attack for 2, then move to end step. Thassa blinks Gearhulk so we can destroy the Cloud Shredder 2. We draw a card and pass the turn, sitting at a somewhat comfortable 7 life. Opponent untaps and drops an Elspeth Conquers Death. I forgot this card existed since it rotated out of standard, but it gets us here by eating our Thassa. How poetic. Before they end the turn. We untap and play a tapped Cave. We move to combat and attack for 7, dropping the opponent to 12. Post-combat, we play Garuda. This time, it doesn't say you win the game on it, but it might as well. First, we hit a Torrential Gearhulk, which lets us cast a Planar Incursion and draw us a card. We blink Gearhulk, which draws us another card and lets us cast Teferi's Time Twist. This time, we target Garuda. We let the stack resolve and move to end step. Garuda comes back, and we get a Mirror Converter off this one. Not the best hit, but it still draws us a card and grows our board some more. We discard some useless cards to hand size and pass the turn. Opponent untaps, and ECD does trigger, but it doesn't conquer death this time as the opponent explodes. Game 3. We're on the play against Azeka, and we keep at 7. We start things off with a tapped Fellmire and pass the turn. Opponent starts by drawing and playing a Forest before passing. We untap and play an Island, followed by Saturu before passing ourselves. Opponent untaps and plays a Swamp, followed by a Weatherlight completed before passing. We untap and play a Shipwreck Marsh, so we're just going to put Garuda in hand and attack for 2 before passing the turn. Opponent takes the simple route and just plays a Plains before passing it back. We untap and play a Swamp before moving to combat. We attack for 2, and post-combat, we cast Helm of the Host. We've got nothing else, so we pass the turn. Opponent untaps and plays a Plaza of Heroes, followed by Azeka, God of the Tree, before passing the turn. We untap and draw and play a Mox Amber. It resolves, and we play and crack a Polluted Delta. We grab a Watery Grave to untap and cast Garuda. This has won us the game the last 2 times it's resolved, so let's see. And we hit nothing. Womp womp. That's okay, we have Helm of the Host to make copies. We attack and pass the turn. Opponent untaps and plays a very ambitious Reliquary Tower before casting the Battle of Bywater. Well, There goes Garuda. That's okay, we have some reanimation to get it back. They make a food token and pass the turn. We untap, and we start by putting Helm of the Host on Satoru before moving to combat. So Satoru says whenever she or another non-token creature enters, we get to draw a card. So she herself can be a token, and she will trigger from her own ability. We attack, and post-combat, we play Scalding Tarn. They crack their food, and we hold onto the Tarn and pass the turn. Opponent untaps and plays the One Ring. It enters, and they gain protection from everything. They draw a card, and we finally crack the Tarn. We grab a Surveil land and put the Discover land in the bin. They draw their card and play a Forest before going to Wombat. They attack for 1 and pass the turn. We untap and immediately move to combat. We make a token and draw a card. We attack with everything menacingly and hit for 0. Oops. We don't want to kill Azeka, and we don't want to not have Drown open, so we're just going to pass. Opponent untaps and takes their damage to the One Ring. They draw for turn, then activate the One Ring to draw 2 cards. They follow this up by casting Day of Judgment. We take the chance to drown the Judgment, and it works. They play a tap land and pass the turn. We untap and move to Wombat. We draw a card and attack with everything, hitting them down to 9. We don't do anything else after, we just pass, discarding a Self-Reflection along the way. Opponent untaps and takes their damage to the One Ring again. They play a tap land and cast No Witnesses. We can't allow such an injustice, so we counterspell. They respond back with a Countervailing Winds, which would be a problem if we didn't have Pact of Negation. They respond by drawing 3 cards, and the stack resolves before opponent passes. We untap, and I guess Pact of Negation was for our opponent this game, because they couldn't pay for it this turn, and they just lose. Game 4, we're on the draw against Harbin, and we keep at 7. Opponent starts with a Plains and passes. We draw for turn and start with an Ice Tunnel and pass. Opponent draws and plays another Plains, followed by a Luminarch Aspirant. We edit out most of its trigger, and they pass the turn. We untap and play a Swamp and a Solar Transformer. We make 3 energy and pass the turn. Opponent untaps and plays a Surveil land. They put it in the graveyard and move to combat. They get another counter and attack for 3 before passing the turn. We untap and put Garuda in our hand. We play Scalding Tarn and pass it back. Opponent untaps and plays an island. They follow it up with a Faith-Bound Judge before moving to combat. They put the counter on Aspirant and attack for 4. At the end step, we crack our Tarn and grab an Undercity Sewers. We Surveil and put it in the graveyard before moving to our turn. We untap and play a Mana Confluence. We cast Satoru and pass, holding up Otawara if we need it. Opponent untaps and plays an island, followed by Elspeth, Sun's Nemesis. They take it down to make some tokens before moving to combat. They put their counter on a token and attack for 4. They drop us down to 13 and pass the turn. We untap and play the Otawara. We need our 6th land so we can cast Blood on the Snow. We destroy everything except Elspeth, and Satoru comes back because we have 2 snow lands. Satoru draws us a card, and we pass the turn. Opponent untaps and makes 2 tokens with Elspeth. Next, they play a Wedding Announcement and Prince Imrahil the Fair before passing, trying to rebuild the royal family, it would seem. We untap and start off with a Hostage Taker. It resolves and we exile their prince. We have the mana, so we cast it from Hostage Taker's ability. It resolves and we play a tapped Jwari Ruins and pass the turn. Opponent untaps and they cash in their Elspeth, removing the last counter to pump a token. Then they proceed to cast their commander, Harbin. They follow this up with an Aenok Bondkin. They move to end step and make a vampire token before passing the turn. We untap and play an island, followed by Garuda. Garuda triggers and we mill some cards. We find a Dream Eater, so we can Surveil. We keep Thassa and Clever Impersonator on top, then we pick up their Wedding Announcement. After that, we draw a card from Satoru, which makes a token with the Prince. We pass the turn here, holding up Siren's Ruse. Opponent untaps and plays a Plains, followed up by an Ogre Talk. Then move to end step, and before the turn is over, we cast Siren's Ruse on Garuda to blink it. I intended to draw with Satoru first to put the Impersonator in hand, but I guess I have auto-order triggers on, so it gets milled instead. That's okay though, we hit an Urtai, so we can blow up this Ojurtalk. Ojurtalk dies, so it returns to the battlefield transformed under its owner's control. We draw 2 cards from Satoru, which causes our Prince to trigger, making another token before we go to our turn. We untap and start with a Thassa. Thassa resolves, and we follow it up with a Spark Double on Garuda. It resolves, and we get another trigger. This one hits a Gelatinous Cube, so we use it to eat their Anoik Bondkin. Satoru draws us another card, and we make another token before we move to the end step. Thassa triggers, so we blink our Garuda again. It triggers, so we mill some more cards, and this time we hit a Massacre Worm. We get the worm, and it triggers, wrathing their board, and they scoop it up before the trigger finishes resolving. This deck was a blast to play. Sometimes Garuda just whiffs, like we saw in the game against the Zika, then it died and didn't do anything else for the rest of the game. But that's a good example of why I build these decks to stand on their own without the companion, just in case something like that happens. Then there's games like the one against Slivers, where we didn't do much of anything with Garuda, but when it did come down, it put so much power on the board with Torrential Gearhulk that Slivers couldn't answer it, and they just scooped. The best game by far was the one against Harbin, because we got to show off almost every aspect of the deck in one game. Hostage Taker got the flavor win by forcing a Prince over to our side, we found Spark Double and Thassa for Garuda, and we hit a Massacre Worm to clear away their entire board. If they hadn't scooped there, we likely would have won the next turn just by attacking, but we could have gotten so much more value out of that if the game had continued. For losses this week, I only have 2 games that I lost while recording. Fun fact, I used every game I recorded for this video. Took a lot more editing than normal, but I did it for you. The first game was against Brea, and we just kinda got ran over by artifact synergies. They didn't even really do that much, but they did enough where we couldn't really establish a board presence, and we were eventually overrun by Thopters. Even Brea herself has an ability to dome us for 3, so even if we could get back into things, we had almost no life gain, so it would have taken a miracle to turn this around. The other game was just me being dumb. They were playing Voha, Jaw of the Conclave, and when I was reading the card, I was like, okay, Ward 3 is a problem, but we can answer this. Then when I actually played my removal spell, I didn't realize Ward triggers twice with Roaming Throne, so I just insta-shame scooped. I didn't even want to try getting back into it at that point because I felt so bad punting like that, but now I know for the future. Anyway, that's everything for today. You can find a full deck list in the description below. While you're down there, feel free to tap that like button too. It adds 1 mana to the YouTube algorithm and I greatly appreciate it. If you liked the video and want to see more, feel free to subscribe so you can become a member of the Blue Crew today. If you enjoy my content and want to check out some more of it, then you can check out last week's video where we played Lucky Charms with Gigantha, or you can click on this playlist to watch some of my shorts.